What's good, YouTube? It's me, your boy Squiddy, back in another Squiddy. So we just had the 3v3 YCS that took place in Brazil over the course of this weekend, and it was actually live streamed day 2, which is really, really cool, even though the quality was not the best. But hey, I can't complain, honestly. If we're getting live streams and we get to be a part of the action live, that's all that really matters. And with it came a plethora of surprises. I mean, just looking at this breakdown for the top 16, I'm honestly super surprised that Unchained was taking the top spots by quite a margin, more than double the second place deck, which was Kashtira. And I have to say, I'm really, really surprised. I knew the deck was good. We all knew the deck was like super good, super solid, consistent, did a lot of things, and played through a lot of hand traps in the metagame, but we didn't expect it to be by and far the best deck, at least for this event. It seems like all of the best players, especially the NA players that traveled down, were playing this deck, and I think it's just really, really hyper consistent, and the fact that you're allowed to play around so many hand traps so easily with its built-in engine is part of the reason why the deck did so well. We also see that we have Kashtira obviously at 3, trailing behind, as well as Purely. Those are no surprises there. One thing to note with this event in particular is that you kind of got to see the tech choices and what players were anticipating for the start of the format. It looks like Duelist Nexus made like a huge impact. And one thing that was pleasantly surprising was that people were actually playing anti-spell fragments over D-Barrier. Well, not really pleasantly per se, but it was just a bit of a surprise there as well, because most people were playing D-Barrier, but I think people realized that, you know, everyone's siding Crossout. All the Purely players and Fusion players were siding Crossout designated for D-Barrier, so they went back to the option of anti-spell fragments. And in a deck like Unchained against Purely, when you are able to establish like a DDD King and flip anti-spell fragments, anything that they can chain, you can just negate anyways because it would summon from deck, right? So it's just really, really interesting to see the top players kind of adapt to the regionals results that we've been seeing over the course of the past couple of weeks. I think this is a good indicator to say what cards we want to play for the upcoming regionals, as well as YCS Vancouver. If you guys haven't seen already, we kind of made a video about Droll and Lockbird, and I think after these results, I have to say that I'm liking Droll less and less, just because it's not very effective against these decks at the forefront. Like, it's decent against Dragon Link and maybe Fur Hire, but that's really about it. All the other decks you really don't want that card against. But I won't open that can of worms again. You guys can watch the 2 videos that we have recently on the channel talking about that. So with that, I kind of want to discuss some card options that I think we should definitely start considering for this metagame, now that we have an actual premier event pass by, and see what top players are actually considering. Now that we have that kind of shaped, I think a lot of people will be replicating it, will be copying it, will be playing what's tried and true and done well at this event. So they're probably going to start playing decks like Unchained. All right, so now let's take a look at a couple of card tech choices that I think you guys could definitely add to your repertoire, whether that's in your side deck or potentially main deck moving forward. But we definitely have to consider, especially if Unchained is the best deck moving forward. At the forefront is actually MEISTER. This is a hand trap that saw marginal play in the past, but it's always been kind of in a weird spot, because most of the time when card effects activate in the graveyard, there traditionally are better ways to deal with it. So we already had cards like DD Crow, and also cards like the Bystials, which were recently released. So MEISTER never really had its place, I think, in recent years. We even had Ghost Spell, for example. But against this deck specifically, because the effects activate in the graveyard and then it's actually doing something from the deck, there are not a lot of cards that actually react to that besides Ash Blossom. So playing 2 or 3 copies of MEISTER effectively means that you're doubling the number of ashes that you have in your deck. And because the Unchained deck actually does rely typically on 2 or more cards to start their engine, so like setting one of their traps and then using either Aruha or the Shavara's effect in the hand to pop it, that means that they're kind of investing like a resource and a half, because you obviously go 1-for-1 with the trade in the graveyard effect, summon from deck, but you also have them burnt out that effect to destroy from hand, which brought out the card, right? So that kind of does a little bit of value as well. It's only once per turn effect for Shavara and Aruha, so they wouldn't be able to do it again. And the nice thing about this card especially is that it's a level 4. It's also very meaty. It has 1700 attack, which is probably the highest of almost any hand trap besides like Watt, Kinetic Puppeteer, I think. And it's really nice that it's a fiend, so if you're playing a deck like Chimera, you can actually use it as a fusion material to fulfill the purposes of the Flying Mystical Beast fusion. So really, really nice option there. I think the glaring issue with MEISTER is, unfortunately, there are not a lot of crossover in the meta. It's not highly effective against any of the other decks. You can still obviously side it against things that activate in the graveyard. So for example, Salamangreats, they still have a lot of cards that actually activate in the graveyard. So all of their extenders like Spinny or potentially Jack Jaguar, all of these guys activate in the graveyard. But you're going neg 1 to kind of stun them for the turn with a card like MEISTER, so it's not like super effective. But again, if you don't have anything deciding against a deck like this, then Skullmeister could definitely fill that void. You can also hit random other things like potentially Tearlaments. It's nice that against Tearlaments, you can actually hit the Shufflers as well. So hitting Agito and Kelbeck are always nice. And obviously the Shufflers themselves, the effects activating the graveyard, you can always hit those cards as well. So it always has some defensive options there. You can hit other things like dragons, for example, the Heavenly Seal effect, summon Magnum up from the deck. It's potentially something that you could deal with. Against Branded, you could also hit things like Saroner or the Branded Trap to add back a potential Branded Fusion that's in the graveyard. So there are some instances where there's marginal crossover, but the card's obviously very low impact against the other decks. You could also hit the Chimera Fusion effect to return from the graveyard, which is still decently good sometimes just to cut them off of the Guardian Chimera access, which is like one of the big things. But I still think that if they get to that point where they're resolving and ripping out of your hand, you're probably going to lose that game anyways, because with the Skullmeister, you're losing 2 cards, so it's not ideal. Even if they don't have Guardian Chimera access, they still have the Sword Knight and stuff in graveyard, so generally that's probably enough. But give you an example of cards that you could put in if you don't have anything else to put in better. It's mostly to beat Unchained, I would say. If Unchained is putting up these numbers, the same numbers that it does for YCS Brazil as it will be moving forward, then that means that we should probably prep for the best deck, right? So Skullmeister could actually have some validity there. Another really cool thing that you can actually do is play Phantasmay, and I'm actually a really serious advocate of this card because it hits a lot of things in the metagame. I know a lot of people actually forgot about this card, but the truth is there are actually a lot of Link decks that are actually maybe not the top decks, but also the rogue contenders as well. The nice thing about this card is it has maximum crossover, especially in a very diverse format like this. There are actually a lot of Link decks that are actually like tier 1, tier 2, or rogue tier status. You know, there are things like Salamangreat, there's Dragon Link, there's oddish rogue decks like Marincess. People are playing Vanquish Soul. It actually got to the finals, which is kind of crazy. It's very good being able to fix your hand against this deck. Scareclaw stuff in the Manadium decks. People are even playing Trap Tricks here and there. Like if they're still playing the 3 structure decks, it's still a possibility. Even against Rescue Ace, they do a lot of link climbing. So even going against things like Heat Soul, sometimes they have 2 link monsters, so you can just draw 3 cards, which is even more broken. Against Infernoble, there's a Sold and Charles. Against the Furhire deck, obviously using it before they go off into their plays off Donner. It's very nice because they don't sprite lock you before doing all of this because of their Link 3. There's also the Sundelon Rika deck that goes into links, and even roguish decks like Sky Striker. So there's actually a lot of crossover for this card in particular. Against the Unchained deck specifically, I know that some people were commenting on the previous video how to beat Unchained, where this card can still be linked up off of Unchained Soul of Anguish, so they just make Anguish and then link off with the Phantasmay to go back into one of their Unchained Link monsters, traditionally probably the Unchained Soul of Rage, so they still have that for your turn. But the thing is, they still have to waste an extra body to go into that because this is a Link 3 monster, right? So Anguish is Link 3, they're going to use the extra body, which is kind of awkward, especially if they're playing in a way that they want to beat Nib, because a lot of players I saw on stream were kind of playing conservatively, just committing like maybe a DDD to the board, not the full combo, so they can still have a lot of resources in the hand to play around Nib. And that just makes it a lot harder for them to go into Anguish, right? It kind of like forces them to commit into the potential Nib that you might have drawn off of the Phantasmay. And the Phantasmay being able to fix your hand is especially good in a format where there are a lot of decks with either playing a lot of non-engine cards that you can cycle through or playing certain bricks, right? If you're playing like the Chimera deck, you know, Fallen Malbaz, for example, is a brick. If you're playing like Destiny Hero package, then those cards are also bricks. So being able to sculpt your hand and draw into hand traps simultaneously, I think is really high impact. Even if we lose the Phantasmay, that's fine. It's a free body anyways, right? It's a +1. You're drawing 2 cards and then putting back 1. Traditionally, you would probably use this on the first link that they make, so something like a Yama, and then hope that you can draw into Nib to stun their board, and then they also have to deal with the Phantasmay. If they get rid of it, that's fine. We don't really have to negate and destroy, so they don't get the effect. It's just like a free body that we didn't really care about. It's just like really annoying for them, and the purpose is that we were able to draw into hand traps and fix our hand. Another card that I've actually been thinking about is DD Crow. So this is kind of in the similar vein of Skullmeister. It's a little worse against Unchained specifically because when it gets to the point that DD Crow is actually live, I feel like they've already done most of their combo, but you're still able to hit something like a Shyama, potentially cutting them from access into DDD Wave Hiking Caesar, which is the main offender against most of the decks in metagame, especially because this guy actually doesn't activate once per turn, but he's multiple times per turn. So having 2 materials means he can negate up to 2 cards, which generally spells doom in a fast-paced metagame like it currently is. In the other matchups, it's actually quite useful against things like the Pure Lily. So when they go and target a spell card to rank up from their graveyard, you could chain DD Crow, and a lot of times that serves as a effect veiler as well as getting rid of the problem spell in the graveyard. So if they have something like the Purely Delicious Memory, it's just gone for the remainder of the duel. So really, really nice there. Against other decks, it does have some crossover against Dragon Links, obviously targeting something in the graveyard that they're trying to recur. Against Branded, you could hit like a Branded in red target like we used to side it for specifically. Against Chimera Fusion, it kind of is a lot worse because of the aforementioned reasons with Skullmeister, where if they're already getting to the point where Chimera Fusion's in the graveyard and they're trying to recur it, it's probably too late. But it's just a card that still has that potential toolbox utility to be able to do that. It's not like you're going to lose every game that they combo off whatever deck. It just has that marginal utility to prevent you from losing the game in niche scenarios. And there are a lot of decks that use a graveyard, even Salamangreat and stuff. So I think it definitely has some crossover. I would still say Skullmeister is probably a little better than DD Crow, just looking at Unchained, if we're still trying to pick and choose non-engine cards specifically because Unchained's good. But DD Crow just has some nice options as well, being a winged beast in certain decks that does come up. So just thought I'd mention it here as well. And then the other card is obviously Cosmic Cyclone. Everyone already knew this card was good, especially against Unchained, mostly going first, but it's decent going second. It's just not nearly as good because going first, you can get rid of the target, which means the monster stays in hand and you banish the card that would have gotten the effect special summon when it's popped. And then going second, you can hit the Escape the Unchained, but they can just chain it and recur a bunch of resources. It's not the best, but getting rid of Escape the Unchained is super important. But more importantly, I want to bring this card up because everyone seemed to be siding anti-spell fragments in the top cut of this event. Like all the NA teams were siding this card over D-Barrier because I guess that they figured out everyone was just siding the crossout designator for the D-Barrier. So it meant that crossout just is a huge blowout calling D-Barrier, right? So having the anti-spell fragrance is obviously a lot better, especially when they have something like the DD King or Caesar to back it up. So they just negate any purely spells that are chained or whatever spell is chained to try and special summon a monster. So I think Cosmic Cyclone is really, really crucial for hitting the anti-spell fragrance as much as it is effective against Unchained in general, being a very, very good first option as well as decent going second. This is definitely a card that I think everyone should consider moving back to their deck. Obviously, the book cards are very, very impactful. They're not nearly as good against Unchained, especially going first. This is definitely a card that we should bring out because all of their cards have the effect where they can pop face downs. But Book of Moon, again, is so good in the metagame. We already know it's good against Kashtira. It's good against Purelees. It just has so much utility going first, being able to blow them out. Going second, able to hit problematic cards like a Rise Heart, potentially even a Purely XYZ monster that's being targeted by Purely Leap to rank up, which makes them lose their target. And more importantly, being able to hit the Wave High King Caesar because this card is Rukalos for 2 effects. It's crazy. This guy's not once per turn. I don't know how they designed this card, but we need to get rid of this card off the table. A lot of times, cards like Skullmeister are effective, but if their hand is decently good and has multiple non-engine extenders, then they're probably still going to be able to go into the Wave High King Caesar. So that's where we have to fill our deck, not only with hand traps and preventative measures, but also defensive options that allow us to mount an offense by Book of Mooning the problem card, so aka the High King Caesar. It's a little weird because sometimes they can play around it by making the Nightmare Griffin instead to act as the skill drain, which cannot be booked because it's Link Monster. But I still think the existence of the Wave High King Caesar is like the main offender that prevents a lot of decks from playing their starters and starting off into their plays. So this is a guy that needs to be booked immediately. So that's why I think going second against this deck, it's still valid to keep in Book of Moon. And this is definitely a card that we should be considering now more than ever. And then last, I want to talk about the Triple Tactics Rust. It has so much utility going second, especially against a deck that has effects that trigger immediately. So against decks like Kashtira, obviously the Shangri-La activating in the standby phase. It's a little worse against Unchained because you do have to bait out their monster effects. So you kind of get like that weird, awkward space where they're getting some value. If they're already using one of the negates off of the High King Caesar, then does it really matter? Like we're just playing into it to activate Thrust, it becomes a lot worse. But I think there's some nice utility with this card in the metagame that there's so many different monster effects. A lot of decks are monster effect heavy right now. A lot of decks are playing hand traps. And being able to tutor into something like a Change of Heart, that's actually a decent blowout against the Unchained deck. We saw in the, I think, top 4 where Pack actually Triple Tactics Rusted into the Change of Heart, being able to steal the Wave High King Caesar. And because he has an effect, it means you can protect yourself from things like Nibiru, which he did. And it's really nice being able to get rid of the problematic monster, but also give us a board monster and one that protects. It's just really, really insane being able to attack and then go into a main phase 2 Zeus as well. And the nice thing about Change of Heart is that you can steal something like a Nightmare Griffin and just link it off. So it has like a lot of marginal utility. It has a wide range, and Triple Tactics Thrust being able to search into your engine for certain decks if you're searching like a Terraforming or like any spell card to kind of start your engines. Even in the Unchained Mirror match, being able to search the Abomination Prison is really, really cool that it's a normal spell, right? So I think this card definitely has a lot of merit for going second because it's just so useful. You can search board wipes for Casteria, you can search your engine pieces, and you can search blowout cards like Change of Heart. So yeah, I mean, if we missed any cards that you guys are actually considering moving forward with after this weekend's YCS, definitely let us know in the comments below because we have another YCS coming up next weekend. YCS Vancouver, right? We're going to be there. I'm going to be there. So if you guys are there, say hi, by the way. But we need to know what cards to play for that event because this is kind of shocking. It came out of nowhere. I was not preparing for Unchained to be the best deck, but now it's like suddenly we have to take drastic measures to beat that deck because it's probably going to be most represented. Other than that, thanks guys for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next video.